Well, good morning. Where'd you go last week?
Last 2 weeks I was across the.
You were at the state fair.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you make it?
I did not. I didn't submit this year.
Charlie was there at the ag building with the beekeepers one day.
Ah, well, that's good.
And evidently Randy every once in a while ends up in the 4-H building.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, I didn't head there this year. Hopefully next. I didn't submit anything this year, so.
But Charlie was there, wasn't it?
No, I didn't submit anything. Otherwise, I'd have been there and checked it out. So, well, good. Well, welcome this morning, and as we continue on in our study, and today we're going to look at some things that were probably a little uncomfortable, just because we remember them as such. As we're up into what we're talking about today, some of this is kind of more fresh in our memories, at least as far as our study within the last 10, 12 years. And so as we look at them, yet it's very important that we look at that, because remember, one of our goals has been to try to understand the things that are going on, understand the forces that are working and affecting not only society, but us that are in the church, and how that is. And so some of these things will bring back certainly some memories, but it's important that we look at this and talk about this. So this discussion, first of all, is not meant to be political, even though these are topics that were very political at the time, or take positions, but it's presenting these things to illustrate the issues that we're talking about. There's a divide in this country, and there always has been throughout our history, and it's been more pronounced sometimes than at others. And if you dig into history, you find out that the really feely-good narratives that we get, which are certainly there, but there's also other things that are often forgotten or left out, and then you realize that it's really kind of, it's been a mixed picture. And it's always been a mixed picture. And not just here, but in every country that's ever existed. And this pronounced divide has been growing and manifested or exposed for many years now, and is very evident today. Now, prior to him, the election of Barack Obama, and again, this is not picking on that, but looking at the time frame, our first black president was supposed to demonstrate that our country had moved on from the racial problems of the past. Okay, if we all remember that, at the time of his election, the thought was, okay, that'll calm that down. Well, yet for many, those painful issues were reignited, and actually it seemed that things seemed to get worse or bubble up as we remember. And for some, that was very confusing as to why that was. It's like, wait, this was supposed to have solved it and shown that, we've moved on. While others viewed these events as unresolved issues, certainly going back to the 60s and the civil rights battles of the years earlier. And so it seemed that it brought up unresolved, at least in the minds of some, unresolved issues. Some have claimed that this bill.
I didn't wait very long.
No, you didn't wait long at all.
It goes back to I just had a thought while you were saying all that.
Uh-huh.
And especially because of bubbling up, the unchanged attitudes, things of that sort. Jesus worked so hard on that for those few years.
Yes.
He worked hard on love,
Yeah.
but he worked as hard, not as hard, but almost as hard. The second issue is repentance.
Sure.
And without repentance and without love and a personal self-cleaning of a mind and a spirit and a heart, the issue of the radicals in society, anti-blacks, let's say, or
Yeah.
anti-anything other than pure white,
Yeah.
just not going to be easily overcome because the evil one has a major foothold in that arena. That's all.
Yeah, these are challenges, and these have been challenges that have been around since way before we were ever living, and much, much further than that.
Don't be a Samaritan.
Now, some have claimed that this divide was brought on by Donald Trump. Well, that would have been 2016, at least as far as the election. And others claim he only exposed issues that were already there and brought them out in the open. So certainly the last number of years, we saw this happening a lot. 80% of the evangelical white community strongly supported Trump, while 96% of the black Protestants voted for Hillary Clinton. Okay, so there was a Republican and Democrat. There were Christian leaders who powerfully endorsed Trump on what was presented as biblical grounds. In other words, this is why he should be the candidate of Christians. And yet, there were other Christian leaders who vehemently opposed him, and on biblical grounds of morality and character. And each side felt that theirs was the righteous position, accusing the other of picking and choosing what they would acknowledge or ignore in their candidate, or thinking such critique did not apply to their candidate, only the other. And so again, you get this very confusing and difficult scenario that's going on, and each thinks theirs and the other isn't, and so on. And when you have that, it gets difficult. Uh-oh. Heidi, are you not letting me change? Here we go. Social justice and civil rights were influential in the culture war that was fueled by the division in the United States in general and the Church of Christ in recent years. As we mentioned before, many in the United States believed our nation had reached a new era when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. But that seemed to prove not to be so, and the racial conflict seemed to rise to a level that had not been seen at that time in decades, at least as far in the public arena and on the news every night and so on and so forth. This conflict was often explained and blamed on the old racist attitudes of the past, while dismissing any thoughtful, legitimate critique. However unresolved these issues have been, rather than continuing to ignore or dismiss them, it has brought about discussions on these issues to foster a deeper understanding and promote reconciliation. In 2012, we remember the firestorm that resulted in the news story of the death of Trayvon Martin. Okay, that was a young man who was in Florida, and he was unarmed and was shot in an altercation with George Zimmerman, who was a neighborhood watch commander down in Florida. This story dominated the news cycle for a long time, as you recall. President Obama even said if he had a son, he would have looked like Trayvon. That was all over the news. When the jury returned a not guilty verdict on behalf of Zimmerman, things got even worse. And those who claimed to have looked at facts said Zimmerman was defending himself, while others saw the verdict through the lens of the long, continuing, in a sense, biased history that there had been against black people in this country. And so you have two really big things there. You have those that say, well, we're looking at facts, law and order, all these kind of things, and that's not an invalid perspective to a degree, but against also the backdrop of, wait, this has been happening to us forever, and it continues to happen, and so on and so forth. And so you see these very, very charged and passionate things that are going on, and often everybody was screaming their position and nobody was listening to the other person, as a lot of times happens. In 2014, we had our own Ferguson incident involving the shooting of a black man, Michael Brown, by a white police officer, Darren Wilson. Many days of rioting and destruction followed, not only in Ferguson, but other areas of the country as well. And we probably all remember that. Misunderstandings of what supposedly happened. Hands up, don't shoot was one that was going around, that he had held his hands up saying don't shoot, and he shot anyway. further inflamed what happened, even though that aspect has been discredited. And it remains fact to many. And so that's a really challenging thing, because you got those that think, hey, what is facts, assuming fact is truth? And so wait, if that's what happened, why are there those that hold on to it? And there's others that say, well, this is the way it's always been. It's very plausible. It probably was that way. And so I'm just trying to illustrate the difficulty of understanding in the situation that there is. When Officer Wilson was cleared, even by Obama Attorney General Eric Holder, there were more protests and riots. And of course, we've seen often in the news, we've heard of what's called the Ferguson effect. And of course, the Ferguson effect is, hey, I'm not going to step out and try to, deal with this or that, meaning from a police officer's perspective, because look at all the problems that there can happen. And so as a result of that, lots of crime statistics in a lot of places went up, because evildoers will take advantage of things, no matter who they are or what they do. And so this just cabal, as Bill was saying earlier, Satan loves these things, loves the chaos, loves all the disunity, and so on. In 2018, these issues came closer to the Church of Christ when off-duty police officer Amber Geiger entered the apartment of Harding University graduate student Botham Jean. Mistaking Jean's apartment for her own, she entered and shot the 26-year-old to death, thinking he was an intruder, as you remember. 3 days after the killing, national media attended a gathering at the Dallas West Church of Christ, where Jean sometimes led singing, taught Sunday school, and occasionally preached. And so here was a Harding University student that people knew and loved and all that. And so he's home in Dallas. And you had, in this case, really what was probably a very tragic mistake, rather than a purposeful. Nonetheless, it happened. And some of this happens in this heightened environment of all these things that are going on that just makes it even more so. But nonetheless, the congregation expressed lament at the injustice, a desire to know what happened, and praise at the witness and character of Bo, as his friends called him. And many in the nation, led by black Churches of Christ adherents, demanded justice for Botham as they waited Geiger's trial. And so again, you have this long history of things, and that's certainly playing into that, and that's not without substance. The jury found her guilty of murder a year after the shooting. So it's gone through the process. And although she could have received 99 years in prison, she received 10 with the possibility of parole in 5. And so, because she has to be responsible with certainly her duty and weapon and so on. But nonetheless, a tragic mistake and accident. Yet, John's 19-year-old brother, Brent, became national news on the day of Geiger's sentencing when he took the stand to offer his forgiveness and gave her a long hug. Amen. And so it was huge. Somewhat like what happened there in Charleston. Remember when the guy came in and shot up the black church, and they also forgave them. This demonstration that certainly was on the mind of all of us. And so this was the environment that's going on. Now, John's killing, along with George Floyd's in 2020, led one Harding graduate, Jackson House, to propose Harding change its chapel auditorium name from George S. Benson Auditorium to Botham S. Jean Auditorium. And why was that? Because the racial policies of George Benson, who was the president from 1936 to 1965, were well known. While the name change did not happen, a memorial to John was unveiled on campus in 2021. And so as we've covered in the history of things, you know, we see that these things with prominent members, you know, had attitudes, but that was the culture and the environment that they were raised and grew in. And, you know, culture is a very powerful thing. And, you know, that's why I always caution us, where we are here, looking back in judgment, not that we don't make judgments, don't get me wrong, on then, as if, how could you have done that? Well, we wouldn't have been any different, because that's would have been all that we knew. So to speak, I don't mean everybody, but you know what I'm talking about. And so, but nonetheless, and so this was that period, as we remember, was going on, not just here, but in other things. This was a period of changing names of the military bases, tear down the statues, so on and so forth. That's this atmosphere that's going on. And for some, they look at it, what are you doing? And others were looking at it as, those are terrible symbols of what happened, we should get rid of them, is the perspective, wherever one comes down. And so anyhow, so there was a memorial, or the change did not happen in that. And so part of this is a period of time where people are finding flaws in people, and somehow by erasing those, that they should dismiss everything else about them instead of all the good. That, you know, because Benson did a lot of good too, in a lot of things. And so when you get caught up in all this, it's easy to go with that flow. And I'm not necessarily saying what's right or what's not, but the point is this powerful environment that's going on. At Oklahoma University, a similar episode happened when there were those that demanded the main chapel of Hardeman Auditorium. So their chapel was named after N.B. Hardeman, who we chronicled back in the 20s and so on. He was a major figure, did the tabernacle sermons as we went over down there at what was now the Grand Ole Opry, or the old Grand Ole Opry. And they wanted to change that. And so there's people looking around for these things, and so they're finding it there. The name made many blacks feel unwelcome in an auditorium named after someone who held racial views that were not very welcoming. Therefore, President John de Steiger, and I heard him right after he became president, was down there because my daughter went to school there, renamed the Chapel Ba Auditorium in 2019, since Benton and Pamela Ba, who had actively sought racial unity and reconciliation, had recently given a $1 million gift to Oklahoma Christian, and so the president thought the timing was right. And so, for whatever that's worth, you know, money talks, or is an excuse. But again, you know, those are decisions that people have to make. But nonetheless, this atmosphere is going, trying to supposedly right things of the past by changing these. And some are very pro for that, and some are very skeptical of those things. And both have points. Both arguments have points. Of course, some people opposed what they viewed as an unfair focus on the race of the past. Said, hey, you're focusing on things that are gone. We're here now. Whether Hardeman's, Benson's, the nation's, or our fellowship. Some people viewed the renaming of the building as an attempt to rewrite history. And so the argument goes, hey, shouldn't we talk about these things, use this as an excuse to talk about these things and deal with that, rather than acting almost like it didn't happen? Is kind of how the argument goes. Some people viewed the renaming of buildings as an attempt, we said, to rewrite history. Others viewed the attention to racism as divisive. Because you're talking about uncomfortable topics, you're being divisive. And so one would say, then how do we ever talk about those things that need to be taught? Who's talking about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, as some have phrased it? And so nonetheless, these things get very difficult because it gets very touchy, very emotional, very sensitive, no matter who you're talking to. Critics of these changes tended to focus on histories which focus primarily on the good and noble stories of the past. In other words, let's focus on just the good. Many people landed somewhere in the middle of this. As we've gone over and over, there's a wide spectrum. And so you got those here and here, but there's a vast middle of really where most people are to some degree. And they wanted institutions to be honest about the good and the bad in the past. They often felt renaming memorials was not necessarily the best solution. And Churches of Christ were a microcosm of the broader debate over historical memory that reached a fever pitch in the last 15 years, basically, as we recall uncomfortably. Amid national reconsideration of the memorial landscape, Churches of Christ joined the reckoning for a good reason. Historian Corey Markham, in 2022, and he's a professor at Freed-Hardeman, where Joe goes, and in the analysis of the memorial landscapes of educational institutions related to Churches of Christ, revealed that 5 of the 15 institutions have memorials, which he's defining as physical spaces or structures named after an individual, honoring black people, with a 6th university planning to do so. So he's saying, okay, there's 5. Obviously you have Lipscomb was one of them, Oklahoma, ACU did, and so on. But anyhow, the only historical black college and university in Churches of Christ, Southwest Christian College, had 8 memorials named for black honorees, whereas the prominently white institutions had only 1 each, except one school added 2 in 2021. Most of the memorials at our predominantly white institutions were honoring black people who experienced wrongs, meaning, for example, Botham Jean. That would be one that experienced wrong, rather than celebrating achievement. Okay, and so, what does that mean? Who knows? But just interesting. Reconsidering memorial landscapes, not only at schools, but at churches and other institutions, had taken on a new urgency and complexity in the 21st century. And so the thing is, these struggles are still going on. How do you deal with these things that many feel are unresolved still? Others say, hey, let's move on. And others say, wait, how can you dismiss that? And so we're still in a time, and will be, of trying to figure out this long history. Yes.
Where is Southwest?
Is it Tyler, Texas?
Oh,
It's in Texas. Is it Terrell? Okay, Terrell, which is that in the east or the west?
East of Dallas.
It's what?
East of Dallas.
Okay, east of Dallas is where Terrell, Texas is. And then we covered the beginnings of this institution quite extensively early on in the class. But yes, that's where this is. Now, after the death of Freddie Gray was in Baltimore. That was someone that was, and I don't remember the exact details, but he was put in a van and supposedly got really roughed up in the van. And so there was questions of what happened. Some said he was just throwing himself around in there to injure himself. Others questioned whether other things happened. I don't know if it was ever really clear, but that's who Freddie Gray, and he died from, I think, those injuries that were in the van. What?
From throwing himself around.
From what some say. Lawrence Rogers, the progressive minister of the West Side Church of Christ in Baltimore, was convinced that Jesus is in the streets. Rogers believed that people on both sides, the protesters and the police, had trouble seeing humanity on the other side. In other words, everybody's so worked up, they're talking past each other, yelling past each other. Nobody can see the other person's points. They're dismissing them as theirs is more valid. And so it's really hard to talk about those things and to deal with them when those situations happen. Therefore, he and other area ministers practice nonviolent protest, but also encourage dialogue between priests and protesters in hopes of mutual understanding. In the end, writers believe the gospel compelled Christians to seek peace and justice in the city, not simply the church. And so here we see this idea that we've looked at and explored before, of this idea of, is this the only place Jesus is supposed to be? But are we as Christians supposed to bring that out into our world and make it a better place, is how the argument goes. Some would say no, when we have that very privatized relationship with God, as we talked about, what you know, you and him, and these other things don't matter so much. Or there's others that say, shouldn't we take that kingdom of God and spread that out further? And so this is where, you know, this is not Lipsconian. This would not be what David Lipscomb would say, per se. Okay? Because he was, not that he wasn't for serving, he was just for ignoring those things and just trooping on. In 2012 to 2022, Churches of Christ adherents remain divided over police killings and the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, remember that came out after I think it was there, but became very prominent after, I think, George Floyd, what happened up there in, Minnesota, right? I get my Minnesotas and Wisconsins mixed up, but up there. And the relation of the gospel to social justice, a distinction that unfolded chiefly among racial lines. After the incident in Ferguson in 2014, African-American scholar Tanya Smith Bryce told the Christian Chronicle, Christians should be in the streets and at the policy table to affect change. In other words, these societal wrongs, as there are these problems, this isn't right, that Christians should be deeply involved in striving to make that better, that those things don't happen because they're just not right. And Christians are supposed to be about doing what is right. After 50 years of preaching, black minister James O. Maxwell agreed, noting that he saw an increased willingness on black adherents to participate in nonviolent protest. And so what you have is again, these things that were more prominent in the 60s, and it kind of died down, and they've kind of been raised up. And some would say, well, why did that all start again? Well, some would say because those things weren't really resolved. Now, in all these things, and it doesn't matter where somebody comes down, there's always those that want to fan and drum up things. And for whatever reasons. And no side has a unique hold on that. And so, nonetheless, it's stirring up. Not only black adherents, but some from other racial and ethnic groups increasingly lifted their voices. Prompted by the racial tensions that now engulf the nation, racism against blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and other ethnic minorities. In other words, these things brought out some that were seeing it everywhere, in everything. And so we have seen over the last decade and a half or so the real prominence. We've heard about about the white supremacy. We've heard about those things that were, those attitudes were there before in the past. And some are seeing those and ascribing almost any and everything to that, which may or may not be the case. But nonetheless, this heightened environment of things that are going on. William Lofton Turner, Tanya Bryce, Sandra Parham, and David Fleer published an open letter signed by 27 ministers, scholars, and leaders in the Christian Chronicle in August of 2016. And I looked this letter up, and it it would not have worked putting this up here because you couldn't have told a thing from it. But nonetheless, we have some significant people in our fellowship that are signing this letter against this because this has really come out. As partisans of the kingdom of God rather than any political party, these leaders named racism as sin and expressed solidarity with Black Lives Matter's movement's desire to talk about ways in which black lives are deprived of human rights and dignity. And so that was what was supposedly that was behind that and was. They condemned the inclination of many white members to trivialize the Black Lives Matter slogan. And so there were, if you remember, there were those that said, hey, wait a minute, all lives matter. And so there were those that viewed that as trivializing. Wait a minute, you're getting off the point. Look at all these things that have happened to us. And so how can you dilute that with saying that also? Was kind of how the argument or the pushback happened. For many in the white church, in the churches of Christ, such as white preacher Eric Gentry, racial justice and reconciliation are central to the gospel of Jesus Christ. In other words, when we read about unity, and we read about equality, and we read about all are one, there is no Gentile and Jew, male, female, and so on and so forth. That's a passage that he's appealing to, among others. And so, if we don't have that, how can we say that we're really striving to be Christians? Is basically what his point is. If we're participating in division, doesn't mean everybody's participating in division, but just saying as the argument's going. And actively seeking racial justice meant expressing solidarity with the anti-racist goals of the new civil rights movement. And so there's some that felt very strongly about this. And of course, often in all this stuff, you got those who feel so strongly about the position, feel that everybody else ought to feel just like they do, and think just like they do. And it doesn't mean there's not substance to what's being said, but often when you get that, it makes it difficult to be able to have talks. Perhaps the most famous black Church of Christ leader in American history, Fred Gray, at 91 years of age and still practicing law, received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2022 for his legal work against racial policies. Gray received other awards as well, including an honorary doctorate from Lipscomb in 2012, and I think we were down there for the Jubilee or the summer celebration they had. It was one of them that he was down there, and maybe it was that one, which was the very institution he'd filed the lawsuit against, as we recall, in 1967. And although Lipscomb President Steve Flatt had apologized for Lipscomb's segregation policies to a gathering of African American adherents at Southwest Christian College in 2001, hard feelings remained after decades of poor relations. And so you see this attempt of trying to reconcile, trying to undo some of the things of the past and so on and so forth. And usually that's very difficult and very awkward. I mentioned before that this has been years ago, where it was one of our elders' meetings, and I remember it was John Burnett, and this isn't negative or anything at all, but he said he couldn't understand how we were always reaching out, as he said, to the black congregation, but we just didn't seem to have it reciprocated with what his frustration was that he expressed. Well, this is why. This is that long history of distrust and so on and so forth, and so you know, and you know, it's sobering as you look at it, but one can understand. And I also think I shared that a number of years ago, when I was reading these histories, and I was just almost crying at some of this stuff because I didn't realize a lot of this as I'm learning about it. And I guess I came to the conclusion, this is just me personally, that I would have been like they were, rather than like Marshall Keeble was. I would have said, I don't want anything to do with you. And so, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that's just realizing how I felt about stuff. And so you can see, very, very difficult kind of thing. Now, Fred Gray, for those of you who don't know, he was Martin Luther King's attorney, one of them. I think he represented Rosa Parks, you know, on the boycott thing. And he represented King on things. And so he was at the heart of the civil rights. He's legally trying to deal with things, and very significant figure. And of course, he's a Church of Christ elder, minister, and continues to this day. He's still living. So very, very fascinating. But Lipscomb continued to work at repairing relationships. In 2016, Lipscomb honored Gray again by naming its Law Institute the Fred D. Gray Institute for Law, Justice, and Society. The Christian Scholars Conference, under the direction of David Fleer, established a Fred D. Gray Plenary Lecture in Human and Civil Rights. Now, what is a plenary lecture, you ask? I looked that up last week. And instead of being the keynote, it's one of the other speakers. Meaning they got a lot of speakers at this conference. And the Christian Chronicle interviewed Gray multiple times in the 2000s, and his message was consistent. We've made substantial progress, but the struggle for elimination of racism and equal justice continues. Is basically what he said. Now, this is Brian Owens. Some of us know Brian Owens. Brian Owens, which at one time was at Ferguson Heights, is now at Florissant, and he's one of the ministers there. But Brian's a brother that has a musical career. You know, records and things such as that. Is it even proper to call them records now? I guess records are coming back, at least as far as the vinyl, right? And so he's been around a long time. He's been here leading singing when we've done some things, the singing programs and so on and so forth. But anyhow, in our material, they had gotten this out of the Christian Chronicle. And I think last year at Maryland Heights, I had said to Brian, I said, Brian, did you know you're in a book? And he said, no, I didn't. He said, oh, they must have got that from the Christian Chronicle interview, so that's where this came from. But anyhow, the others disagreed on various fronts. Brian Owens, a leader at the time of the predominantly black Ferguson Heights Church of Christ, which, if you remember, when Lee was here and we were going over to the various singings, we would go over to Ferguson Heights and other places as part of that.
With Berkeley Heights, and then they moved when they bought the property over there off the Hanley, the airport bought the property.
That's when they became Ferguson Heights?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for
Berkeley Heights first.
Berkeley Heights, then became Ferguson Heights. I think we were going when it was Ferguson.
Yeah. See, Ferguson, there is no Ferguson Heights, but they wanted to keep part of the name of Berkeley Heights, kind of like the, so that's why they named it Ferguson.
When they moved, okay, well, thank you for that. That's always good to have those details. And he chose not to join the protest in the streets of Ferguson in 2014. For Owens, worship is our protest. In a sermon late in 2014, he preached, we are not surprised by the lawlessness of man, the arrogance of politics, the irresponsibility of the media, the dishonesty of religious leaders, the false teaching of self-proclaimed modern prophets, or the inability of government to bring justice, fairness, equality, and peace into this world. And he reminded adherents, our kingdom is not of this world. In some ways, Owens expressed notions similar to what David Lipscomb would say. That would be his view. For Owens, worship and living with love would allow people to see the glory of God. And so in all this, everybody wasn't always had the same idea or the same solution. And so it's difficult, and it's still difficult, but nonetheless. If black church leaders disagreed on the best response to the new civil rights movement and the relation of the gospel to social justice, traditional churches of Christ were far more homogenous in their reaction. On one hand, the preachers, prominent journals, and television programs remain nearly as silent as during the 1960s. Jeff Brown analyzed sermons given by 10 churches. Now, this is a small sample size. It's important to point that out. But nonetheless, it is illustrative. By 5 white and 5 black pastors in Jackson, Tennessee on July 10th, 2016. And of course, what had happened that week before was there was Alton Sterling on the 5th of July, Philando Castile on the 6th, and I can't remember, were they, I don't know if it was shot or whatever, I don't remember exactly on them, but then there was also the 5 Dallas police officers that were shot that probably made more news, if you will, that was on the 7th. So after a week of these deaths, he looked to see what was going on in the pulpit. And of the 5 white pastors, only 2 mentioned the events of the week, and only 1 mentioned the death of unarmed black men. In contrast, all 5 black pastors made explicit mention to the week's events. Race did not dictate what a pastor would say, but race was the greatest indicator about whether or not a pastor would address the racially charged violence. The pattern of white silence amid black protests had a long history that continued into our 21st century, meaning unresolved. You know, I remember my mom. When we would try to talk about difficult things, my mom was one that moved on to the next subject. She did not want to talk about things that were uncomfortable, no matter what it was. That was my mom. And so it's not surprising that as people, we may feel that way. You know, an uncomfortable thing, let's just pretend, let's just kind of ignore it, let's just go on. Or I come to church not to hear about that stuff. I'm trying to, and that's valid, those are valid positions. And there's others that say, how can we ignore the 800-pound gorilla that's going on in our culture that we're all dealing with and seeing all the time, yet we don't even talk about it in here. And so that's the dynamic, the struggle, if you will, that goes on about, you know, what to do. And hard to find answers to that. Yes, Bill.
There's also, did it say anything? Probably not, or it would have told us that. Did they see a purpose behind this? In other words, for us to be silent concerning some miscarriage of justice concerning the black.
What was the last part you said?
For us to
why should we care?
Silent, may have 2 purposes, but on the opposite side of that scale, you can exploit it.
Sure, and that's happened.
And so, which is the right and which is the wrong? The exploitation is wrong. The silence to ignore it or cover up is wrong. So how do you actually approach it? If I was a pastor or a minister trying to decide how to bring that subject up, that'd be a hard one.
I wish I could give you an answer with certainty, and I cannot. It's very difficult. And again, the purpose of this is to illustrate the difficulty in trying for this exact thing that you're talking about. There's people that want to try, but or whatever, they feel something, but they have no idea what to do, which is probably most of us. And there's others that feel very strongly this, and there's others that feel very strongly that. And so it's just like somebody comments on a sermon, best sermon I ever heard. Same sermon, somebody comes, that's the worst I ever heard. They both heard the same sermon. So, you know, it just makes it difficult. The World Video Bible School, whose most popular videos had more than 1 million views, had videos on the sinner's prayer, heaven and hell, the Bible, the denominations, Islam, Christian America, same-sex marriage, dancing, dress for worship, fundamentalist apologetics, and more. But in a search in 2022 for racism, civil rights, and social justice, or Black Lives Matter, yielded 1 pertinent video on the YouTube page. One similar silence, a spiritual sword, was effectively said nothing about civil rights, Black Lives Matter, social justice, or unjust deaths of so many at the hands of the police. And so, you know, very different views. And of course, you know, like for example, the thing with the Black Lives Matter, which had a whole lot of support, certainly initially, but then you see, and this happens to anything when sin creeps in and damages stuff, we find out later that its leaders were taking and pocketing the money themselves, or at least some of them were. That doesn't mean that all the goals or whatever were invalid, but when you see leadership doing things like that, just like when you see a preacher that's embezzled or adultery or things like that, it just, and so these things get messy. And I think Satan gets up there and he just says, how can I, he's not taking sides, he just wants to wreck everything. And so, but anyhow, and we'll have one more thing here. Gospel advocate Greg Tidwell's 10 trends affecting the churches of Christ in the 21st century did not include concerns about racial justice or civil rights in American culture. Tidwell did express opposition to the social gospel in a critique of mainline denominations, and we know that critique goes back 150 years when we looked at the social gospel in the 19th century. And he did acknowledge as part of his third trend, demographic shifts, the existence of ethnic divisions among churches of Christ, and that the nation was very conflicted over ethnicity. In other words, there's just a lot of difficulty and unsureness about how people deal with these very real things in a way that's constructive. And sometimes through the lenses that we look, we can't see the other points of view. And it makes it even more difficult and challenging. But again, going over this, and we're going to end here, is that this is out here. These are the things that we're dealing with. These are the real life things that we as Christians and trying to reach other people, we have to deal with those things. And so it's important that we're certainly aware of that. Okay, we will end there, so thank you very much. A little over.